Have you ever heard of a shield that promised to revolutionize the mobility of the US Army, but turned out to be a complete failure? Today, you will know the history of the M10 Booker, a machine that was born to be light, agile aerotransport, but has been lost in its own weight and bureaucracy. Get ready for a deep dive into disastrous decisions, billions of dollars, and a military project that has fully fled control. They wanted a light fighting vehicle that could be transported by a C-130 plane and launched from parachutes in combat zones. The idea was simple: total mobility, quick response, fire support wherever it was needed. And it was not something new. The M551 Sheridan, used between the 60s and 90s, already had this concept. A light shield that could be launched with parachutes and accompanied the troops anywhere in the world. However, Sheridan was outdated, with weak shielding and chronic problems. The Army needed something new, more robust, with modern systems, but still respecting the principles of air mobility. General Dynamics Land Systems, a company that had already manufactured the famous M1 Abrams, presented a bold proposal. The M10 Booker, a 105mm cannon, was promised, enough to support infantry and neutralize light threats. It would have state-of-the-art sensors, modular armor, and, most importantly, would be aerotransport. On paper, it seemed perfect. The project was named Mobile Protect Firepower and had everything to be the new war horse of the modern era. But that's when the deviations began. The first change was the requirement for greater protection. The Army began asking the vehicle to resist landmines, RPGs, and modern anti-tank weapons. Result? More shielding, more weight. With each meeting, a new requirement was added. The requirement to operate in urban environments brought the need for additional sensors, 360-degree cameras, reactive protection, and this made the vehicle grow, both in size and tonnage. Soon, it was clear: the M10 Booker could no longer be released from parachutes. Worse, it could not even be carried by a C-130 without deep modifications. The original mission of creating a light shield was being slowly buried under a stack of technical PDFs and contradictory requirements. Another serious problem was the choice of ship systems. Instead of using state-of-the-art technologies, the M10 was equipped with 90 systems such as Sinker's radio. Yes, that's right, equipment already outdated in times of digital war. While other countries already tested autonomous vehicles with artificial intelligence and total integration with drones, the M10 Booker was practically analog. It was like placing the Windows 95 operating system in a current gamer notebook. This choice was justified by cost cuts and ease of integration, but in practice delayed development and set any attempt at future modernization. And if that was no longer enough, in 2022 the Army made an even more controversial decision. It officially removed the requirement that the M10 would operate autonomously or remotely. In other words, it no longer needed to be compatible with distance control or robotic platforms, something that has become standard in many modern armored. This removal was a shot in the foot. In addition to placing the project a decade behind competitors, it limited the M10's ability to operate in high-risk environments without putting lives at stake. The Army, which once wanted an agile, technological, and futuristic machine, was now walking to deliver a 42-ton with recycled technology. Could not be launched by parachute, could not be transported by medium planes, did not operate remotely, and it used radio systems from 30 years ago. If the M10 Booker already looked like a project distorted on paper, the operational reality was even worse. When the first prototypes began to be tested on a basis like Fort Campbell, an uncomfortable truth came to light. The weight of the armor made its full integration impossible with existing structures. Base bridges simply could not stand 42 tons. This was not an isolated problem, but a symptom of how much the project had lost contact with the initial concept. How was a vehicle designed to be aerotransport and mobile became too heavy to operate even within the American territory? Military and logistics officers began to sound the alarm. To move the M10 between sections of the base, it took a previous study of the routes, this on American soil. Imagine in a hostile environment, with poor infrastructure and makeshift roads. The armored shielded troops anywhere in the world now needed a map and a calculator to find out if it could cross a stream. Mobility went to space. Meanwhile, General Dynamics continued to deliver what it promised: a vehicle with high firepower, dense shielding, and intimidating presence. But that was not what the Army had asked at the beginning. What became clear was that the project had been captured by an industrial logic, to build what the industry knew how to do, not what the military really needed. And at this point, frustration was already widespread. The costs began to climb. The development of the M10 exceeded $1.5 billion quickly, and this only in the early stages. Each unit cost around $12 million, a value close to that of a main battle tank, such as M1 Abrams, much more powerful and technologically sophisticated. The Army wanted 500 units, but as delays and problems increased, this goal became increasingly distant from reality. Internally, the program responsible for the program began to face severe criticism. Confidential documents leaked by the military involved in the project showed that the concerns were ignored or minimized. One of the reports warned, "We are creating a vehicle that does not fulfill any of the original goals." Another internal document described the M10 as an armored Frankenstein, the result of commitments that nullified the usefulness of the concept. The complaints came to Congress. Parliamentarians began to question the costs and, especially, the Army's relationship with General Dynamics. A specific point generated revolt. The contract provided that the company would maintain the exclusive right to repair several components of the M10. This prevented the Army's own mechanics from performing complete maintenance. In other words, if something broke in the field, soldiers would need to expect a team from the manufacturer to repair something unthinkable in a combat zone. It was the equivalent of selling a war car with warranty clauses that prohibited the owner from opening the hood. This issue of the right to repair generated a political crisis. Several members of Congress have come to defend laws to prevent similar contracts in the future. The argument was simple. How can the Army depend on a private company to maintain its operating force on the field? In a real conflict scenario, this kind of dependence could cost lives. Meanwhile, the deliveries went slowly. Of the 500 shielded shots, only about 80 were delivered before the program was put under review. General Dynamics argued that it was fulfilling the expected deadlines, but the military knew that each new unit delivered was actually a repetition of the same mistake. There was no magic solution. The M10 had already passed the point of return. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll gave a frank interview that fell like a bomb behind the scenes. "We wanted a light shield. What we received was a tank almost the size of a Russian T-90, and without the same effectiveness." It was the first time that a military authority publicly admitted that the M10 Booker project had failed its central proposal. It was like signing a confession before the whole country. This statement was the trigger for a deeper debate about the future of light combat vehicles in the US. After all, if the world's most powerful army failed to develop an agile and effective armored, what did that say about the relationship between military planning and defense industry? Behind the scenes, the information began to circulate that Pentagon was already studying alternatives to replace the M10 even before the end of deliveries. New proposals have emerged, some based on European models and others focused on emerging technologies, such as electric armor, land support drones, and even autonomous platforms. The very concept of light armored was being reevaluated. After all, take it to, what kind of war? Which scenario? M10 failure has also caused an internal review of how the requirements are defined. One of the main problems was precisely the excessive interference throughout the project. Each new requirement turned the vehicle into something different, until it is no longer what it should be. It was like trying to build a sports car and, in the middle of the process, turn into SUV, then a truck, then by bus, and end a vehicle that is not good for any of these functions. After the public confession that the M10 Booker did not fulfill the original purpose, the US Army was forced to do what he fears most, to admit that he needed to start again. By this time, the project had already consumed time, money, and political capital. And yet, there was no viable alternative in the short term. The Army needed a light shield or something that fulfilled this function. But the M10 had proved that the way it was, this mission was impossible. The first step was discreetly ending expansion contracts. The 500 planned units were cut to 200, then to 120, until the final number stabilized around 80 vehicles delivered. General Dynamics continued to operate the maintenance contracts of these units, but with no prospect of continuity or new generation of the model. The program officially entered the transition phase, a military euphemism for silent abandonment. However, the operational needs still existed. Aerotransport troops, rapid response forces, and mechanized infantry units followed without a reliable light shield. The pressure came from all sides, especially from the 82nd Aerotransport Division, the main enthusiast of the original project. Without an alternative, these forces would be at a disadvantage in scenarios such as Ukraine or Indo-Pacific, where mobility and agility are decisive. It was in this context that a new concept began to gain strength. No longer a vehicle based on conventional tanks, but a modular platform, something that could be adapted to the type of mission, the ground, and the enemy. Instead of trying to make a shield that would serve for everything, the proposal was to create a common chassis, with different versions for recognition, fire support, troop transportation, and electronic war. The Army wanted to learn from the M10 error and not repeat it. But the way would be long. Before any new prototype, it was necessary to rethink the development process. The Defense Department created an internal task force to analyze everything that went wrong with the M10. And the list was extensive. One of the main problems identified was the so-called mobile requirements syndrome, the tendency to change project specifications halfway without considering practical impacts. This had turned the M10 into an inconsistent project, where each advance brought a new setback. Another critical point was the excessive dependence of the industry. The Army has entrusted too much in general dynamics, without establishing clear limits on control and ownership of internal systems. With this, it lost its autonomy about the equipment itself. The question of the right to repair, which had revolted Congress, became a milestone in the relationship between armed forces and suppliers. From that point, new contracts began to include compulsory shared maintenance clauses and full access to technical components by Army mechanics. The failure of the M10 also had side effects on the formation of doctrine. For years, U.S. schools of war had taught the concept of light, fast, and lethal force as part of the new combat philosophy. The M10 was an attempt to materialize this concept, but eventually showed that technical execution was still far behind the theory. The result? Changes in doctrine. The Army began reassessing their employment scenarios, paying more attention to irregular wars, dense urban environments, and operations with severe logistics restrictions. At the same time, failure also pressured for innovation. The idea of an autonomous armored present in the early versions of the M10 project and then abandoned returned to the agenda. Experts began to defend unmanned vehicles for recognition, fire support, and even as baits in combat operations. What seemed science fiction 10 years earlier now was an urgent need. The industry, of course, replied. Companies such as BAE Systems, Rheinmetall, and even defense sector startups have begun to submit alternative proposals. Some models already used autonomous steering technology, smart sensors, and even integration with terrestrial drone swarms. Modern war was changing, and the US could no longer afford to ignore this evolution. Meanwhile, the remaining M10 Booker were relegated to secondary functions. Some were used in training, others were stopped in hangars. Few have been sent to international exercises, but always with severe logistics limitations. The vehicle that promised to follow elite troops anywhere in the world could barely leave home without causing an infrastructure problem. There was also a symbolic element in this whole story. For many military personnel, the M10 represented more than a project error. It symbolized institutional arrogance, the belief that it was possible to overcome the war with large, expensive, and theoretical equipment, ignoring what soldiers on the ground really needed. It took a failure of this size to provoke serious reflection on the role of innovation in the armed forces. At the end of 2023, a new guideline was published by the Pentagon. All armored vehicle projects should include, from the outset, autonomous operating modules, state-of-the-art communication systems, and compatibility with integrated tactical networks. Sinker's radio, used on M10 and outdated since the 1990s, was finally retired from the new models. This guideline was born literally from the rubble of Booker. And there was more. One of the greatest criticisms of the M10 was that he was not invoiceable with NATO allies. Its pieces, calibers, and systems were too specific. This generated difficulty in joint operations, as well as disturbing international logistics. The new model, still without an official name, born as a successor of the failed M10, was developed based on platforms already used by allies, such as the Swedish CV-90 and the German Lynx. The idea was clear: never get stuck in a closed and limited system. Meanwhile, the soldiers who had tested the M10 in the field saw skepticism the backstage movement. Many had already lost confidence in the high command. For them, the promises of innovation were repeated words. What mattered was the practice. A veteran sergeant said directly during a congressional audience, "We don't need Wi-Fi tanks. We need something that works, moving, and protects us." The M10 Booker was created at the request of the 82nd Aerotransport Division to be a light, agile, and aerotransport armor, inspired by the M551 Sheridan A vehicle that, even with its flaws, even with its faults, that it was able to be launched from parachutes and support infantry in quick operations. The idea was simple: putting a 105mm cannon on a lightweight chassis to fit in a C-130 and robust enough to survive a real combat. The deviation of the original concept was fast and drastic. Each year, new requirements arose and old goals were abandoned. The transportation capacity by C-130? Eliminated. Parachute launch? Cancelled. What was left was an increasingly heavy vehicle with almost 42 tons, which put it closer to a traditional tank than a light shield. With this weight, there was no way to use it in missions that required implantation speed or air mobility, precisely the central point of the 82nd Division request. In addition, ship technology was largely obsolete. The M10 was equipped with 90s inherited systems, such as radio sinkers, a model that, although reliable in its time, was not compatible with current network communication standards. This compromised not only interoperability with Allied forces, but also made any modernization of the vehicle difficult. In the middle of 2022, it was expected that the M10 would come with autonomous or remote operating modules, something already common in the new armored in Germany, South Korea, and even China. But surprisingly, this requirement was removed from the project. The M10 has basically become a 90s tank with a new painting. The logistical problems also shouted loudly. The weight of the vehicle made its use unfeasible on several American bases. Fort Campbell, one of the main bases of the 101st Aerotransport Division, could not simply operate with the M10. Most of the internal bridges of the base could not support the weight of the armored. The same happened in training performed abroad, where local infrastructure was unable to receive the M10 without heavy structural modifications. Instead of facilitating troop mobility, the vehicle became an obstacle. In the end, the M10 was neither light nor mobile nor suitable for the original role. What should be a practical solution has become a tactical tramble. Its exercise has been limited, and most vehicles were kept in stock or used in routine tests. In some cases, it served as a mobile target for training of infantry units, a bitter irony for a project that intended to lead the new generation of light combat. The strongest criticism came from within. The Army itself admitted that the M10 failed. Secretary Dan Driscoll stated in an interview, "Our goal was a light, reliable, and adaptable shield. What we have is a tank that approaches the size of a Russian T-90. The recognition was hard but necessary." For the first time in decades, a high-ranking military authority publicly admitted that a fundamental project had come out of control. And the numbers widened this failure. Of the 500 units planned at the beginning, only about 80 were delivered before the official cancellation of the program. Even these units faced maintenance problems. General Dynamics, responsible for the project, retained the right to maintain internal components, which prevented the Army's own mechanics from performing repairs and modifications. Congress intervened, drawing attention to critical dependence and lack of operational sovereignty about strategic equipment. This impasse has generated a broader discussion about the right to repair military systems, leading to the revision of future contracts and pressing the Defense Department to demand greater technical autonomy in the next programs. The M10 had failed not only as a vehicle, but as an example of management, logistics, and sovereignty. Still, not everything was in vain. M10's collapse served as a catalyst for structural changes. The U.S. Army has begun the development of a new version of M1 Abrams, lighter, modern, digitized, and full focus on autonomous operation and network integration. This new generation of tanks, still in testing, brings direct lessons from the M10 disaster. modular design, reduced weight, intelligent sensors, and total compatibility with NATO allies. In addition, Booker's failure influenced programs of other forces. The body of Marines, for example, abandoned the idea of acquiring models derived from the M10 and turned his eyes to hybrid platforms between light armored and terrestrial drones. Even the Air Force entered the discussion, pressing on vehicles more compatible with its transport aircraft, a return to the original reasoning that had given rise to the M10. And the future? Learning was hard but necessary. The M10 Booker has become a symbol of what happens when the operational reality is ignored in the name of technical ambitions without practical basis. It is not just about weight or weapons, but to understand who and what is building military equipment. M10's failure made it clear: no technological advancement compensates for the loss of purpose. In the end, the M10 ended up for something not on the battlefield, but as a warning to a new generation of military and engineers. It has shown that even the largest military power on the planet can make a mistake a lot. But it also showed that when the failure is recognized, it can become an opportunity to rethink what really matters in modern war times. Agility, adaptation, autonomy, and, above all, active listening to soldiers on the front line.